Law school. It's an investment in your future. But like all investments, without the right advice, it can lead to disaster. That's where Pre-Law Pro comes in. Whether you're exploring the law, navigating the admissions process, or need personalized career guidance, at Pre-Law Pro, we've got your back. Don't gamble on your future. Invest in it. Get started today at prelawpro.com.
How can I make myself more competitive?
How do I build my network?
I want my career to go to the next level, but I don't really know where to start.
I hate the job I am in. What else can I do?
I want to work in healthcare, but I don't want to be a doctor.
I need connections in a new industry. Where should I start?
Whether you're a college student trying to decide on a career path, a young professional trying to develop their career, or maybe you're in the mid to late stages of your own professional journey and you're looking for a new challenge, or maybe you're facing an unexpected job search. Whoever you are, wherever you are, welcome to the Professionists Podcast. And together, let's find your fit. Welcome back. In this episode of the Professionists Podcast, we get to speak with somebody who has just achieved an incredible amount in a very short space of time. And to be quite frank with you, every time I speak with our guest today, I do start to wonder, as many people do, what it is that I've been doing with my life, because he's just done so much. This week's guest is Command Sergeant Major Logan Leslie. Logan joined the Army at the age of 17 in the wake of the September 11 terrorist attacks, and after entering the Army at such a young age, went on to become a member of the very prestigious Green Berets, the US Army's Special Forces. After doing combat tours in both Afghanistan and Iraq, he went on to Harvard University. That's where he got his undergraduate degree before going on and getting not only his law degree, but also his MBA from Harvard University. After his military career and extremely prestigious education, he remained in the Special Forces community as part of the National Guard, but he now pursues a career as a full-time entrepreneur. And we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff in this interview. We'll explore some of the mental challenges and mental toughness. We'll talk about his time at Harvard. We'll talk about some social issues, but we're also going to do a bit of a deep dive into his career as an entrepreneur. I hope you find the interview helpful and interesting. It was a great pleasure to do the interview. And without further ado, let's just jump into the interview. Thanks for joining us, Logan.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We've spoken before on some other podcasts and in different settings. You've got a really interesting career that we're going to dive into in just a second. But I think you started in the military at a really young age, and one of the youngest people to kind of go through the Army's Ranger course. What was that like at such a young age? Because I think a lot of people look down, or generationally we always look back and go, back when I was younger, these kids weren't this way. And that was probably no different when you entered as a 17-year-old. How did you approach, going through something like Ranger School at such a young age?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's good about the military is it doesn't matter how old you are when you join, you're treated as if you know nothing. So age doesn't really factor in how people treat you. Recruits trend younger. For me, I went to Ranger School at 19. I just turned 19 right before I left. And I tell people today, I have soldiers that go to Ranger School today and they're in their 30s. And I tell them, look, I'm glad I went when I was so young, because as you get older, you start appreciating the finer things in life, and your opportunity cost of your time is greater. When you're young and you're striving and you don't really know any better, that's the best time to tackle huge challenges, I think.
Were you a pretty tough kid growing up?
But probably no more so than an average kid.
Did you find that you were really prepared mentally for the challenges of being in the military?
Probably not. It's something that comes, it comes as you accomplish things that you set out to accomplish in the military and confront challenges and overcome them as you come. So, when I first joined the military, I was 17, and if you had sent me to Ranger School then, I would have failed. I wouldn't have had the mental toughness probably to get through it. And I think I barely had it at 19 when I went. And I, in a lot of ways, that was a pivotal point in my life, because I had decided I was doing this thing and there was no way I was going to quit. And that was tough, and I got through it, and was, I spent a lot of time there, was recycled, I faced a lot of challenges, and I came out the other side, and it was, to me, I came out of it with a lot more mental toughness than I brought to it.
Did you go to Ranger School with the intention of going to Special Forces at the end of it, either to Ranger Battalion or to become a Green Beret?
So when I went, I was a cavalry scout. So it's part of the armor branch. You can't go to Ranger Regiment as a scout. So when I came out of Ranger School, I went to Iraq right away, did a year rotation in Iraq. And over that time, that's when I started thinking about my next moves. And I was attracted to Ranger Regiment, and I would have to have reclassified to an infantry soldier to do that. And I was an NCO by the time I was in Iraq. So I was a non-commissioned officer. And so it's a little different. I was getting a little too old in advance to go that route, and I was very attracted to the Special Forces path, and it's for a lot of different reasons, and that's what I ultimately chose to do as soon as I returned.
There's obviously a physical preparation, but how did you prepare mentally for the qualification course?
Ranger School gave me all the mental preparation I think I needed. I don't have any great insight on mental toughness, really. It's just don't quit, and really nothing in military training is designed for you to fail. Having run military courses and trained soldiers, that's the worst thing. I mean, it's when people quit and they leave and they don't continue to train, and that's not good for anybody. So schoolhouses usually give everybody every opportunity to succeed, and but they're not going to do it for you. And they're going to make it tough. And so, I take that as a lesson in most things in life, is the last man standing or the last woman standing is often the one that wins. And so you may not be the best, but if you can hold out the longest, then you're often the winner.
That probably is a good point for us to jump into this idea of imposter syndrome, which I think a lot of people have heard about, and it's this idea that you're in a position and you don't feel like you should be there or you don't belong. Is that something you ever experienced, especially when you are surrounded by these extremely high performance individuals? And if so, how did you adapt your mindset to say, I deserve to be here, and have some confidence?
Yeah, I don't believe I've ever felt like an imposter. I know it's a very common, imposter syndrome is a very common thing. I never looked at my surroundings and thought I shouldn't be here. I accidentally got here. I never had that. The times where I did feel out of place were more of social settings. And so, coming to a place like Harvard undergrad as a 26-year-old with kids, military veteran, I was not a social fit in a lot of ways, both in, age, right, and generationally, but also just in the socioeconomic class. And so there are things that I didn't know. And so in some of those settings, I felt very out of place. But as far as performance, I do my best work and I push myself the hardest when I'm around people that I feel are better than me at anything. And I think it goes back to like Olympic swimming events, right? Oftentimes competitors do their absolute best times when they're competing, right? If they're up against the world's best swimmer, for example, and you're one of the world's best swimmers, you'll swim better and you'll swim faster. And that's an empirical fact. And who you surround yourself with is probably the largest influence on what you become and what challenges you are equipped to accept and overcome.
You mentioned some of the transitions that you experienced. So when you had to go to Harvard, there was that socioeconomic kind of difference. That's got to be a fairly unique challenge, right? For a lot of, not a unique challenge, a fairly common challenge that a lot of veterans experience. What are some of the challenges that they face transitioning from a life in the military, either, going back to school or moving into the civilian life?
Sure. I mean, it's identity is really to me, I think identity is the number one thing that creates challenges for a transitioning veteran. The military is not a job, and it's from the day you put on that uniform, it's hammered into you. That's your identity, and that's good and bad. Because when you're in the military, it's good. You're part of the tribe, and you'll do anything for the tribe and for your teammates to your left and right. And it's you. You're part of this thing that, by definition, can't survive once you leave. You become a part of the veteran community or part of other communities that are like good or bad, but you're not part of the military identity anymore. And so you have people, probably all veterans, then immediately strive for that. They immediately strive to plug in and get that, and it's not really available, maybe not available anywhere else outside the military, or some various professions, law enforcement, fire department. I mean, these sorts of professions. So it's really tough, and so that's why you see veterans that will wear their identity on their sleeve. And so they'll wear multicam, camouflage hats and name tags on backpacks, and, and they fit a really particular stereotype. And that could be, in certain environments, that's not helpful for you. I mean, other environments, it's great. It allows veterans to identify each other, and it provides a level of comfort and all that. But for somebody that is young, which veterans often are when they transition out, and you are young and you are still learning a lot, and you have to set yourself on a fresh course. You have to. And some of these impulses we have about trying to hold on to that identity can be self-defeating.
Do you think that change or that difficult transition in identity has played into some of the difficult things we see with suicides, for example, in the veteran community?
100%. I mean, losing your identity is a very traumatic thing, right? It's very traumatic. And so that comes to bear on mental health in a big way. I think more importantly, though, is perspective. And so perspective will, it filters into a lot of my views on a lot of issues. But when it comes to veterans transitioning out, perspective is a big problem, because you do things that are, the military culture is very strong. It's very unique. It's very inappropriate when you compare it to other cultures. And that's probably no surprise to anybody. And the type of humor you have, the things that you do, both socially, in the States, in combat, the things you're forced to do, the things you choose to do, they all make sense in the moment. And to the extreme, we talk about combat experiences, right? Those, where else are you shooting a weapon at people and getting shot at? That's not appropriate behavior, right? But in those contexts, it's very appropriate, and you do what you need to do. But you're in that culture, right? You have that identity. It's easy to process that. It's easy to process. This is what I'm doing. This is part of who I am. And I think, that's why you see a spike in suicide when people leave, or when you see a huge suicide rate in older veterans, people that are 20, 30, 40 years outside of service, because the further you get away from those experiences, the more your perspective shifts from that environment, I think, and more it starts assimilating to normal, what's normal, what's around here and socially acceptable. And then when you start processing the things you've done and said and witnessed and experienced with a different lens, those things become harder to understand. And I think that's what drives veterans to mental health problems.
What can people who are maybe in and thinking about getting out, or who have just started that transition back to civilian life, what can they be doing to get some of that perspective that, you've said is so important?
I mean, that's a good question. I would say that I have competing thoughts on this, right? On the one hand, I always tell soldiers, you need to set yourself up for your transition, but your number one priority is to be a soldier. I say it to leaders, mostly officers, NCOs. You see mostly in officers, actually, because a lot of them are trying to wheel and deal their next move 4, 5, 6 years out. And in a critical fashion, I'll say, look, you focus on your soldiers and focus on your job, and that stuff will come. And so my first impulse is to say, just focus on being the best soldier you can be, right, until you are close to transition. My other impulse is that if you're close to transition, you're a year or you're two out, and you're planning, ask advice. So I'm a huge believer in cold emailing people on LinkedIn, or cold calling people, and I've done that a lot. And I believe that's how we actually found each other, Ben.
That's right, yeah. A few years ago now, but that's right. It was just a reach out on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I think, look, that's the greatest resource, I think, for veterans, because times change. The world changes. Opportunities change. When I got out, veterans were not going to top Ivy League schools. It was very, very rare. And it's still too rare now, but it's a lot better now. And so the advice that I would have gotten from somebody 10 years ago is different than the advice a veteran today is going to get. So I think that's why it's important not to be reading blogs and social media, and really go straight to the source. Find people that are doing things that you find interesting and reach out and ask their advice.
What was the most difficult thing about transitioning from Special Forces to Harvard? We talked about some of the social and economic differences. There's obviously some cultural differences, but what was the hardest part about that transition, and what was the biggest observation you had about the differences in culture?
Well, I've been asked this question a number of times over the last years, and my answer changes. And so now it's very different. now that I'm really reflecting on those challenging years, because those first couple of years out of active duty were some of the most challenging of my life until 2020. But
were you
very
married
challenging
at the time?
Yes, I
Yeah.
was, and that's where I'm going with this. Is that we had our first child right before I left. We had no money right before I left. We were newly married right before I left. We moved cross country, to go to a school that I've never visited. I mean, there's a lot of challenges, and I think the number one challenge was family life, and me not doing what I needed to do as a family man, because I had so many other challenges that I was not attending to that in the way I should have. And I'm not that critical of myself. I mean, you live and learn, and you mature and you grow. But the biggest challenge that I faced was trying to make it all work in the household. And because look, that's really the most important thing, because school's important, your career is important, all those things. I continued to serve in the military and the National Guard. That was important, but truly they're not nearly as important as your spouse, your children, your mental health in that regard. And so the biggest challenge was just kind of figuring out how to be a husband and a dad at the same time that I was trying to find my way professionally and through education.
Was it weird being in a room full of 18 and 19-year-olds who, are struggling to, hashtag adult, and, you've seen an awful lot of good and bad and difficult in the world, and, have worried about, is the guy next to you going to come back? And, the first world problems of the average college student. Did you find it hard to empathize?
I mean, yes. So empathy was, it was definitely hard to emphasize. So I'll answer that part of the question. I didn't find it weird, though. I can speak for myself and for what I've seen with other veterans, that a veteran sitting in a classroom surrounded by 18-year-olds is just as, what's the term? Anxious or afraid or what have you of the classroom of his fellow students than an 18-year-old freshman may be of a crusty veteran with a beard sitting in the back of the room, which is who I was. So I didn't in any way look down on them or feel anything like that. If anything, I was intimidated in some ways by how smart they were and how prepared they were and all that. When it came to the hashtag adulting part of that question, perspective again, and this is something that I didn't know at the time, but I've learned, and I truly believe, is that an 18-year-old freshman that is away from home for the first time and is dealing with a paper and is worried about this GPA and they want to go to law school and they feel like their whole life's going to get ruined if they fail this test, that fear and that anxiety and that stress and mental stress is no different than anybody else's stress, right? Your brain doesn't know perspective. It doesn't know that that's not a life or death situation for that person, and if you think that you look at somebody's problems, whether they're a student or a family member or somebody, and you just say, look, you shouldn't be upset. This is not a big deal. Like what kind of reaction are you going to get? It's going to be counterproductive, because to them it is a problem. It is a big deal and it is super stressful. And so, I never looked down on their problems. I never thought, look, I'm better than you because I've had these issues or these challenges. But now I know that what they're experiencing is really no different than some of the things I experienced in true life or death situations.
How did some of those people who didn't have your life experience, who found themselves facing those same stresses, what were some of the observations that you had about those who handled it well, who were able to kind of progress through those situations of stress, who didn't have your training?
Well, the ones that looked to be doing the best were the ones that cared the less, that cared the least, right? And I'm not saying, this is an observation, right? So the students that were there and were not stressed out, and we're having a good time, and all are probably just fine right now. They are on good jobs. They weren't as anxious. They weren't as neurotic. They had a better time, and they had social experiences that the other students may not have had. And I'm not in any way advocating blowing off school, but I think some wisdom in that, right? It's like school is not just a grade. It's not just these gateways. It's so much more than that. And if you can fully appreciate that, then perhaps it's less engineered artificial stress that comes into it. Now, and I'll also make a point, and I know we've talked about this, Ben. I view performance, or like precision, let's say call it high precision performance, and resilience as two ends of a spectrum. And, the more precise a car is, right, like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or a Formula One car, they're not very resilient. You run the wrong fuel and that engine blows up. Where you take my Toyota Tundra, not very precise. I could burn whatever fuel I want in that thing. It is a resilient truck. I could beat the hell out of it, and I do. And it's just, but it's not precise. It's not going to win any races. I feel the same way on people. And, you have a lot of high precision, high performing people that go to, Ivy League schools. I think they score a little low on the resilience side of things.
You had some observations about the people who seem to care the least, seemingly doing the best, and those who are so highly strung they kind of self-sabotage. You and I have talked a little bit about the role, I guess, of class and social and economic backgrounds. In your experience, the people who seem to care the least, were they the ones who had the least to lose?
Yes.
Or the least to worry about in terms of if they didn't do well?
Yes. Yes. So I'll just caveat with this. I'm just making observations here, and so don't take any of this at this point as a recommendation or, it's value judgments. These are all how things are, I believe, right? And so to answer your question, yes, I think the students that go and it just was always on their path to go to this school, and their parents went to the school and they can afford it and they never really worried about it. Yeah, they appeared probably to care the least, and they had the most fun. And there's two types of caring the least as well that I'll go into detail on. So truly caring the least is not a good path, right? You can have a great time and you're not going to get what you should out of that education. It's going to be a waste. I don't condone that, right? Now, looking like you care the least could mean that you have really good prioritization, because to be really good at some things, you have to choose what to be bad at, right? You have to. You can't be good at everything. So if you are at school and you have these goals, and it's to gain these experiences and to do really well in these classes and to learn all you can, and let's say you're not going to grad school and now I'm going to come out with a great degree, I don't need a high GPA, then you shouldn't care about a GPA, and you shouldn't care about getting a great score in some class you don't care about. And so in that class you may appear as if you care the least, but you just have your priorities in order and you're coming out with what you want, right? So I condone that. Now, back to your question on, there are plenty of students that go there and truly don't care because it's on their path, and they're going to be fine whether they went to Harvard or not.
Daddy runs a law firm and they've got somewhere to land.
You probably have that at every school. I'm not picking on Harvard here, but Harvard does have a high percentage of that.
I guess, how do you go about adapting to that process? So let's say you are, someone who hasn't had a ton of opportunities. You've worked really, really hard to get to where you are. How do you have that attitude where you're focusing on the right things so that you don't become so focused on a GPA that you end up self-sabotaging or not doing as well as you could?
Well, if you find out the answer to that question, let me know. It's very difficult, right? It takes intentionality. It takes being deliberate. I'm not in any way an expert on it. I've been very good in certain circumstances. So law students, right? Law students are, as you know, Ben, are probably some of the most neurotic, they're high performing, but they're very focused on performing well relative to their peers. They're very focused on getting really high marks. And that's just part of the game of applying to law school, being good in law school, the legal profession. Those are all, to me, those aren't great qualities. Like if you are those things, that's not a problem. Those don't make for happy, healthy, balanced people. And so when I went to law school, right, I was surrounded, 99% of the student body was probably like that. And I did not care about GPA. I did not care about GPA. I cared about doing well. I read just about every single case. I learned a lot. I mean, I did well, but I did not care about GPA. And my law school experience was awesome. 1L was great. Everyone talked about how first year law school was terrible and not fun. I had a great time. And that was one of the times where I did it right, I think. And other parts of my life, I'm not terribly great at prioritizing and truly choosing what I don't do well at. I would say for somebody that's, really, that's found themselves in a great school and it's kind of a surprise to them and all that, there's no way you're going to know. And you shouldn't really know. You should be eyes open and soaking everything up and enjoying yourself and doing your best to be balanced, I would say. Is just do your best to be balanced.
Yeah, a good way might be don't be focused on doing it right, focus on doing it well. You can have a really outstanding GPA and actually not be that good a lawyer, because a law exam is not going to be the same as being a lawyer. But if you have focused on learning how to do it well, you may not have been the top of the class, but you're going to have the skills and the knowledge that you can then apply to the practice of law once you actually get out there. What were some of the things that you saw in terms of this divide between the haves and the have-nots. So you and I have talked about in the past how there are folks who get into Harvard, and getting into Harvard gives them a chance to change their family tree. And you have other folks who it's almost a rite of passage. And you might have that person who's gone to Harvard because they see it as being this great opportunity to change their family tree, and they get a job at Goldman Sachs. And, there's some snobbery about that. What did you observe in your experience? I don't know if it was worse in undergrad than law school, for example.
Yeah, there's a lot there, man. And I've reflected on this a lot. I love Harvard. Harvard was great to me. It opened up a lot of doors. I'm very loyal to the institution. But my experiences with there, and perhaps these observations that I'll go into, or they apply to all schools, or maybe they're just at top schools, or maybe they're just at Harvard. I don't know. But it's not ideologically diverse, right? And it's probably no secret that higher education is not diverse in that respect. And one thing you get from that, I think, is a lot of hypocrisy on some things. And so one thing I observed, right, is that the Harvard student body is extremely self-critical when it comes to professions that they take when they get out, right? So the whole time I was there, you see Crimson articles and conversations about that there's a large percentage of the undergrad student body that goes to consulting, they go to banking, they go to hedge funds, they go to private equity, a very large percentage. And the student body is very critical internally of that, right? And at least anecdotally, what I've seen is that the students that got to Harvard, and were kind of it wasn't on their path. They were diamond in the rough that was found by admissions and they got in, or they came from a low income background and they hustled and they got in. These are the types of students, these are student profiles that are more inclined to take these safer, high paying jobs right out, because this is their chance. This is their chance to change their family tree. Whether that's correct or just perceived, it's, that's how I would view it. And in a lot of ways, that's how I viewed my ticket to Harvard too. If you're the first in your family to go to college, and you came from poverty, and someone is recruiting you to go work at McKinsey, and they're going to pay you $120,000 a year your first month out of undergrad, what's wrong with taking that?
Yeah.
Nothing. So, I mean, there's that, right? And I don't think there's any problem with that. But the self-critical aspect of the Harvard student body, they would beat up on that. And I found that often the loudest voices that were anti that were those students that could literally do nothing when they graduated, and they would be just fine. They weren't changing their family tree, and they could literally do nothing. And so they would do nothing. Or some of them would take service jobs that appeared to be service but were glorified vacation trips.
Yeah,
right?
save the butterflies in Costa Rica.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that, right? I don't want to single out individual programs, but look, those are great. I mean, service is important, but service isn't truly service unless you're serving, unless you're giving up something of yourself, or
it's going to cost you something.
It's got to cost you something, and maybe it doesn't, right? Let me rephrase that. Service probably doesn't have to cost you something, but if you're going to glamorize it and you're going to get a bump from it and you're going to put it on a resume, or you're going to use it as a cudgel against somebody that's taking a job at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, then it should cost you something. And in what I witnessed, it didn't.
Yeah, it's a service of self rather than a service of others.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, because I know that's a huge piece of your professional life right now. And I'd really like to dive into why and how you decided to go down that path. Because as I said in the introduction, you have a degree from Harvard as an undergrad. You have a law degree from Harvard, and you have an MBA from Harvard. And by any metric, you could have gone out and had any number of really well-paying, quote-unquote safe jobs out in industry, but you chose to become an entrepreneur. What drove you to go down that path?
I asked myself that too, but a couple of things. I was in school for a really long time, as you said. I tell veterans this that ask me for advice, right? Is that I was in school for 7 straight years and wasn't 100% certain what I wanted to do when I came out, right? And there's very low likelihood that if you're anything like me, you go to just business school, right, for 2 years out of the service, and there's no way I think you're going to know what job you want to take when you get out at all. And I think there's a pressure on people to have things figured out and all that. So I did 7 years of school and various internships to learn about what I liked and to learn hard skills. And I enjoyed all those internships. But when I came into work every day, didn't really see myself doing those jobs as a real career. And they were all careers that paid multiples of what my parents ever made in their lives. So they were very, life-changing steps that were potentially there. But I didn't see myself there. And I thought, look, if I'm going to spend all this government money, my GI Bill and Pell Grant and all this on this education, then I should really figure out what I want to do. And I'm not going to settle for something I can't see myself doing when I'm there. And eventually I realized I couldn't, there was nothing that I really wanted to do, right? Which is maybe a problem. And so I wanted to start my own company that had my own values, that did the things that I really wanted to accomplish, because I didn't find that in these prepackaged jobs that were there.
It's interesting too, entrepreneurs. I mean, I think it's a glamorous thing because you go on Instagram or YouTube and you see, some guy in a Lamborghini or a Porsche, like, what do you do? Oh, I'm an entrepreneur. But the reality is you work so much harder and longer when you're working for yourself than you would if you were just a salaried employee.
There's really nothing glamorous about entrepreneurship, I think. That's so self-defeating too, is this concept of a college dropout, 20-something-year-old billionaire entrepreneur. That's statistically insignificant number of times that has happened. And that's what gets all the optics. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the highest probability of success is like a 35-year-old or older entrepreneur who's taken this third swing at it and has 20 years in industry and actually knows hard skills. So, I mean, that's kind of what you got. And investors know that. So if you're a 20-something-year-old college dropout and you're raising investor money, then good on you. But I think that's a fairly rare occurrence as well. To me, another piece is about risk. I think about risk all the time. And coming out of Harvard with a Harvard degree or any top school, and probably most schools, your risk is very low if you fail. And this ties back to our conversation. For some, the risk is higher than others, right? So if you're the rich kid, there's no risk, right? If you have this is your opportunity to change your family tree, then your risk is probably higher. But at the end of the day, if you look at it, you're not going to starve to death. If you have that strong paper, a strong degree, you can take 2 years failing at something and probably still find a job. And in the right parts of the economy today, failure is actually viewed as a good thing if you do something with it, right? So if I'm interviewing somebody who did a startup and, I see that on his resume and I asked him, like, why are you applying for a job now? And they said, well, I put it all on the table and I tried to do this and I worked really hard and I tried to execute this startup idea and it just didn't have product market fit and it failed. I'm going to hire that guy. I'm going to view that as a positive thing. So I think that if you look at it in that way, right, risk is super low. And so for me, coming out with all these degrees and, I had a fair amount of student loan debt and 2 kids to feed. But at the end of the day, the risk is pretty low. Like I'm going to be able to drive an Uber if I need to and afford a 1,000 square foot apartment, which is what I stayed in for 7 years with 2 kids. I can keep doing that. And so why not swing for the fences? Like why settle? This is my view, by the way. Everybody's different, right? You might love your job at McKinsey or Goldman, but I couldn't do that because I knew there was something better and it was harder to get, but the failure, a failure would set me back some time, but it wouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah. So let's tighten the screws of that a little bit. So, when you're 23 and, you just come out of college, irrespective of what your socioeconomic background is, the risk factor is fairly low because if it all goes, belly up, then you turn around and you start all over and you can do that a couple of times before you hit 30, quite a few times before you hit 30. And your situation, like you had a wife, you had some kids, but you hadn't hit the big money at that point. What about someone who is at a consulting group or at a Big Four accounting firm who's making a pretty decent living and has become accustomed to a certain quality of life, or more to the point, the people that they're responsible for have become accustomed to a certain quality of life? Maybe that's a particular kind of schooling or sports or hobbies that their children might have. There's a little bit more at risk because it's not just you who's going to bear the brunt of that, but the people that you care about. How do you assess your own appetite for risk the further on you get in your career? The more success you have more skin in the game, you have more to lose. How do you readjust that calculation the further you get into your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the first thing you outlined is the biggest risk of the mindset of I'm going to make a bunch of money or I'm going to get comfortable and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then I'm going to do A, B, and C.
Yeah.
Then you're probably not going to do it, is what I'm seeing, right? Because I've talked to a lot of my friends from business school that are now 4 years out, and they're making a ton of money at these firms, these huge firms. And the topic of, hey, I'm really thinking about getting out of the game and buying a small business or doing X, Y, and Z. And it's like, there's so much of that there. It comes up in every conversation. And I think probability on people doing it is pretty low. And it's because of that, right? You're not answering just to yourself. You're answering to your family and all that. And I'm a victim of that too, because I set out to do these entrepreneurial things, but my wife, really a saint, lived in, gave up a lot to live in the kind of places we lived when I was in school, and a lot of things we didn't get to do that people my age were probably doing, and she didn't get to do, and the kids didn't get to do, because we were really on a tight budget. So I had to make a change there. I had to get in a better house and put my, some activities, fund some activities and sports for the kids and stuff. So that definitely increased the cash burn and decreased my ability to take on risk. Even though I'm super comfortable with a high level of risk, I had to self-limit in that regard. That's like a very non-sexy, non-profound answer to your question. It's different for everybody. I think generally, though, you can take on a lot more risk. You can last a lot longer on less money than you think you can. And I think generally that's a good principle. I mean, that's what you see all the time.
Does that lead you to kind of think, if you're unhappy doing what you're doing right now, you're better off taking risks sooner rather than becoming more unhappy, more dissatisfied, and taking more risk on down the road the longer you wait?
100%. Because I won't go too far into it, but I've had a pretty interesting last couple of years professionally working on entrepreneurial things and non-entrepreneurial things. But one of my main lessons is trust my gut. I should have trusted my gut earlier on some things, and I should have reacted earlier when it turned out not to be the right path. I do think that that's the case. I mean, humans have a very strong ability to adapt and to accept an okay situation. Most people do it for their whole lives. And they have honestly, I don't know what percentage of the world population just that has the ability and the means to better their situation, but they don't, because okay is good enough. That inertia and that default setting is good because it allows people to be happy in unhappy situations. But I think it's limiting if you really want to do the best for your kids, or if you want to serve in the best way, if you want to change your family tree, if you want these things. Those are ambitious things. It's not, I don't view it as personal ambition. I view it could be altruistic in a lot of ways, but the enemy of that is the okay, and just kind of accepting what's okay right now.
Yeah, it's the old thing of like, oh, I'm fat and happy. I was like, well, okay, you're fat and happy, but are you really? You could be doing so much more. You just convince yourself that just being where I am, fat and happy, is the place to be.
Yeah, it's so contradictory too, because I also am very happy, and I honestly try to be grateful and have gratitude and every single day, and I'm very deliberate about that, and look around my surroundings and say, this is great, like I'm in a great spot.
Yeah,
I do that, but at the same time, I really want these other things. I want to build my business to a certain size. I want to be in a position to serve the government on, in the DOD or something like that at a senior level one day. Like these things that I think that I can add value and want to strive for, that I need to work towards, that are painful to work towards, and they require hard work and sacrifice and prioritization. And it'd be really easy to give up all that. It just kind of let it go and just be happy where I am. And that's not how I'm wired.
Well, it comes back to what you're saying about perspective. Like, yes, you can go too far the other way and be so, quote unquote, fat and happy and just be mediocre your entire life, underuse the gifts you've been given, and just settle. You can also go to the other extreme where you're so obsessed with the next step and you work so hard that you forget to enjoy what is right in front of you. And it seems like perspective. But at the same time, as humans, there's something there, I think, that makes us want a challenge, to strive in some way. Like, some of the most miserable people in the world are the people who have, on the face of it, everything we all think we want.
Yeah.
But they don't have to strive for anything.
I mean, I could talk at length about that. I had breakfast with a good friend last week, and this was the topic of conversation. And some people that I know, some of my investors have lots of, they could have stopped working 30 years ago, but they work, some of the hardest workers I've ever met, and they continue to work. And to some people that just doesn't make sense, but it's because they didn't do what you said. They didn't check out, say, oh, I made this much money and check out, because their source of happiness is work, is working on the things they are passionate about and are challenging, and it requires them to work long weeks and stay up at night and be angry when somebody doesn't come through for them. And like all these things that come with that, that's part of the human condition. And the people that have a number, that's how it came up in the breakfast. It's like, hey, what's your number? What number do you need to make to step away? And it's like, man, there's no number. And like, if there were, and I did have a number, but it wasn't like so I could step away. It was so I could do other things that don't pay any money at all. Like, and like my number.
Have another challenge.
Yeah, I'd have another challenge. That's, and so like I think that's not that I haven't figured out, but I think that's one thing I do well is I know what I want to be. And I know who I want to be, and I've always known that, and it's changed a bunch. It should always change, but like even from a young age, I knew who I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And like that's what it is, right? Because if you have a number and it ends there, it's like, hey, I need $10 million, and I'll be happy. You're not going to be happy, my friend.
Yeah. And because the 10 million is not going to fix the hole is in your heart if you've got nothing to strive for.
It's true.
What about side gigs? How do you view those? I mean, it sounds like we're moving into a time where it's very common for people to have more than one job or more than one income stream. When do you think is a good time for someone to seriously invest in a side gig, and when should they convert that side gig to the main gig? Yeah,
I have lots of side gigs. And my general view on side gigs is that if you do it right, more effective at all of them than if you were just doing all, individually all of them. So, I continue to serve in the military, right, which is a big commitment.
Mm-hmm.
I try to get involved at the local level, and so I'm involved at the state and local level, and have been for a number of years. And these are lesser commitments, but they're still commitments. Trying to build a business, and have been for some time. I have a family, and that's a two-piece commitment, right? Because there's commitment to your spouse, like just your spouse, and there's a commitment to your children, and that's one of my mistakes is I've conflated the two, and those are two separate commitments. And then side gigs are on top of that, right? That's pretty much what I have on my plate, but a side gig could be your startup on the side. And actually I have other things like writing and reading and just various other things I try to make time for. I feel strongly that even if you have demanding side commitments, if you're doing it right, then it makes you better at your business. So I spend less time in my business than I would if I weren't in the National Guard. But I feel like I'm better in my business because I have the National Guard. And so it's about optimization. And it's hard to describe, but it's hard to tell, too, in the moment whether you're doing the balance right. Because it could become a liability if you don't have your priorities in order.
What about someone who doesn't have a business, someone who's an employee, and they've got this side gig that they're desperate to convert into their main job so that they can move away from being an employee and have some of the flexibility. I won't say freedom, because running your own business creates its own set of restraints, but how do you know when to step away from being an employee and going all in on your side gig or gigs?
I don't have any good thoughts on universally how you would know. My gut tells me it's probably sooner than people do, people feel like it, and that goes into the risk thing. Like you could take more risks than you probably know you can. So if you're questioning that, like, hey, is it time? It's probably time. It was probably time like a year ago. I mean, I don't, maybe the numbers don't work, but if you want to do that, look, I can only speak for me. I'm never going to be fulfilled and happy being an employee for somebody else. Never. Yeah. That's me. That's not everybody. So, but for me, if I had to be an employee, I'll be working all sorts of side gigs to try to find something that has cash flow or becomes cash flowing, has product market fit. I can raise investor capital on, or it starts producing its own cash, and then I'm jumping ship as fast as I can, and I'm working my butt off to try to find a side gig that takes. If that's not you, if you're happy with your job, which is totally fine, and I'm envious in a lot of ways, but if you're happy and the side gigs checking other blocks for you, and I don't know what those may be, but it's not your purpose, but it's a hobby, or it gives you some sort of bump in some other aspects of your life,
like a creative outlet.
Yeah, then it's less important to make that decision, I think. because it's not about what you want to be, like what your number one professional pursuit is. If it is, which I guess is the premise of your question, right? It's how do you know when you should jump ship? Kind of implies that you want to jump ship, so as soon as possible is what I'd say.
Yeah. Well, let's dive from kind of the more existential into your exact kind of business experience. So you're the CEO of Northern Rock. Give us a sense of what Northern Rock does and how you came to be there.
Sure. And it's evolving a lot. So it's had different iterations, and that's sort of the story of entrepreneurship, I think. And I started off with an idea that I wanted to work with veterans. I wanted to pluck these great leaders out of the economy, guys and gals that are transitioning out or have transitioned out and have all these great skills, and the market's not there for them. And they're taking, I found it insulting almost to see some of these really senior NCOs and officers taking very low level jobs.
Yeah.
It's just like insulting to me to see that, unless they want those jobs. But most of these veterans I've spoken with, they don't. They know they're better than that.
They're capable of incredible sophistication and levels of functioning. Yeah.
So that's really where it started, and then I got to work in internships and get educated on buying businesses and private equity investing, buying small businesses. And so the concept was, look, I'm going to try to start buying these businesses with investor capital, and I'm going to build this ecosystem of businesses and place senior military veterans into these jobs. And I'm going to take risks, because the reason they're not being hired into senior roles by other companies is because it's risky. Because on paper, there's some of these people are not qualified to be directors and VPs on paper, but I know they are. Right?
There's that loss in translation. They look at that resume and they don't understand the level that these guys have been doing. Is that the issue, or?
I think that's less so that you have a fair degree of military literacy in some of these big companies for hiring managers. I think it's, even if they knew completely what some of these soldiers are capable of, they wouldn't take the risk, because it's risky. Because it's a lot less risky to have a defined list of qualifications, and you either meet them, then we'll hire you. If you don't, we won't hire you. Because look, some of these veterans shouldn't be VPs and directors. Maybe they're a bad fit. I feel like more of them are a good fit than are a bad fit, but maybe they're not. Do you want to be that HR manager that has to stand in front of the boss and say, like, hey, why did this guy not work out? He did not meet any of the qualifications. Well, I took a risk on him. Like that's why it doesn't work that way. And so by the way, the organization also has to support that veteran. You can't just throw one in there and expect them to sink or swim rather. You need to find the right one. You need to build support mechanism around them. And there's a lot of hard skills that veterans just don't have, that you're going to have to be prepared to teach them and provide them those skills. There's a lot of softer skills that they have in spades, and they're going to find them in a veteran 10 times out of 10 more than they're going to find them in a civilian counterpart. So that was really the concept here. And it's been ups and downs, initially we were going after infrastructure type businesses, and we had deals come along, and we got far along on it. It didn't work out, and took a little break from it and operated a security business for a while, and back into it now. And we're focused really strong on the automotive space. And so I'm buying up auto shops, and we bought one last month. We got another one closing next month, and a bunch in the funnel. And there's a commercial real estate aspect of it as well. So it's slightly different than the initial thoughts, where we're buying pretty large companies and not that many of them. Now we're buying really small businesses and putting them together. And the veteran talent is more on the tech side, the technician side. And then as we grow, we'll execute our strategy on the management side, but we're not there yet. So it's going pretty well, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Fill in a gap for me. So, you finish your education and you've been living in this 1,000 square foot apartment. How do you go from that to raising capital to buy businesses?
It's all about network. It's all about mentors and good advice. And it wasn't easy.
Yeah.
Raising capital was way harder than I expected it to be. Now, I meet people all the time who say that was really easy, and they must have had a really good idea, and they must be much better at pitching ideas than I am. So I only know my experience, and it was challenging, but it really came down to having the trust of people that I got to know through professors and through classmates and, people that are in your network. And because especially these high risk ventures, they're investing in you. They're not investing really in your idea. And the idea is part of it. It needs to make sense.
Yeah.
It needs to have a pathway to becoming something big, but they were investing in my, in what they thought was my ability to just hustle and to make it work.
You mentioned mentors and the importance of a network. Usually people have more than one. Sounds like you did as well. Just think for a moment of one of those key mentors. How did you come about them? How did you find that mentor? And how did that relationship go from just some guy you were introduced to someone who was willing to put their money where their mouth was and to back you financially?
Yeah. So I'll begin by saying that there's a lot of really superficial and like cheesy networking that goes on all over the place, everywhere. But I saw it a lot in high level universities, and I am allergic to that. I very much don't like that. The butt kissing and like, and
it's
just
so
kind
transparent too.
Yeah. Well, it's transparent. I think for a lot of these people receiving that, it's not transparent to them. They're just used to it, and anyway.
They'd be blinded by it.
Yeah, they get blinded by it over time, and so I had no use for that. And so I have a few mentors, but it's kind of an eclectic mix, and they're people I met in different ways, but there's not a lot of them. It's a really very few, and they're people I met through the military, just being in the military, and just met them organically and worked with them. And the ones that are one of the financial backers, I was introduced to through mutual professors, and then it was, then it was just being genuine and having genuine conversations and doing all that. So I don't think there's a trick to it. Maybe the insight is you don't need a lot of them. You need a few. You need people that you trust their judgment, because it works two ways. So part of it is you putting on your best face and being respectful and showing that you're worth their time. But it works the other way. Like there's no point in trying to play that networking game with a bunch of heavy hitters if they're not going to trust their judgment and you're not going to ask them truly personal questions at junctures in your career or in your family life or your personal life and get their feedback, because that's what they're there for. And like, that's really when you need a mentor, not when it's like, oh man, I got this awesome startup idea and now I need $5 million. Let's look at my mentor Rolodex. That's not what mentors are for. They're for like, oh my goodness, I am in a bind right now. Like the clock is ticking, and do I do this or do I do this? And I don't really know what to do. So let me ask this person I trust and what their advice is. And those you're not going to find them by, I mean, maybe you will, but I don't think you're going to find those people by like going to a networking event, quote unquote, and
well, the depth of the relationship is important too, because your mentor, you have to give them permission to say, Ben, this is a bad decision. You put yourself in this spot. Here's the mistake you made. Now let's talk about how to get you out of it. But you have to be willing to let them say difficult things to you. And that only comes when I talk about like people think of networking. You talked about this kind of cheesy networking before, and it's the person who comes in and they suck up and their whole attitude is, I'm going to meet people to get something from them. But I found some of the most effective networkers I know, their first instinct is to give something long before they ever get something.
Yeah.
And that might be, if you don't have a lot to give, let's say you're in a vulnerable part of your career or an early part of your career, it might be to give a genuine relationship, to show interest in what this person is doing. And that might happen for a long time before you're ever in a position to be able to ask for something from them. But the transparency that comes with just trying to get something doesn't turn into the kind of mentor relationships that you're talking about.
Oh, you hit the nail on the head, but I wish I was as eloquent within it as you were. I mean, as you were talking, I was obviously listening to what you were saying, but I was also running through my head of all the networking events that I've went to, and I'm trying to think. I mean, I was definitely guilty of it in undergrad, because I was trying to figure out all sorts of stuff. So I was going to these, I was sucking up to rich people and like industry titans and like, oh man, this is going to help me one day. And that's what I was trying to think back to, is every time I've ever done that, has any of those ever turned into a relationship, or was it valuable at any point, at any juncture, any tough spot? Have I ever asked any of those people for advice? And I did not. Not once.
I mean, I can think I've had people who would say really complimentary things about me. It was always a pretty easy kind of conversation. But the people who had the biggest impact on me, I can think of one for sure, who's a former boss who was harder on me than anyone else has ever been. But as a consequence, I know I can pick up the phone and say, hey, I've got this professional or personal or whatever issue. Tell me your thoughts. And they'll be able to give me insights that no one else would.
Yeah, that's a mentor.
Yeah, absolutely. And mentors turn into sponsors down the road.
That's right.
In the right kind of way. Logan, if we could just talk a little bit about the day-to-day life of being an entrepreneur. So we've talked about some of the challenges. We've talked about the need to be open to risk. What does an average day look like? Because, we've talked about how when you work for yourself, you're going to work harder and you're going to work longer than if you work for somebody. So when does your day start? When does it finish? How do you balance spending time with your wife, spending time with your kids, taking care of your own mental health and your physical well-being? How do you balance it, and what does a day look like on average?
Sure. Okay, I'll talk about the balance to begin with. And again, you and I have talked about this, Ben, but this is something I work on very hard because I've seen very successful people able to master this, and I'm nowhere near mastering this, but I'm getting better. It's fast transitions from one task to the next. And some of these really powerful people that I know and are investors, they schedule their day in 15-minute intervals, and they'll take a very heated, important call and put the phone down, and then they're 100% in the moment with you a second later. And that is powerful, right? That is super powerful. And I think that's how balance occurs when you have all these competing priorities that are very intense and you work very hard. And so in my own life, I try to do those transitions. I try to, now my day is not so scheduled. I'm putting out fires as they come up, and my day ends at a different time every day. But I try to be very deliberate about transitioning. Once I'm done with work, then I'm with my family and I don't think about work. And it was a lot more difficult when I was working from home, because your office is your home. Now that I have an office to go to, I have a commute and it's easier. But it goes for in the day as well, because a military thing will pop up and I'll transition into that, and I'll take care of what needs to get done and then switch. And then I try not to think about it. And so I think the fast transitions are really important for that. Priorities too is, you have to be deliberate about your priorities, because, where you spend your time is where your priorities lie. And if you don't tell your time how to be spent, then it's going to tell you how it's spent. And your priorities are going to get out of whack. So it's, with the family, the working out, the home, fixing things in my house, like all that gets planned, and there's time blocks that get assigned to that. Reading, I starting to read more now, which it's always been a struggle in my life to find more time to read, but it's because I schedule it. So I think that, I don't know how insightful that is, but those are the things I work on, is being very deliberate about priorities and scheduling, and then transitioning from one thing to the next very quickly and seamlessly is what I work on. My day-to-day now has changed a bit. Once I was getting this automotive strategy off the ground, I was working from home. I'm in this office right now as I'm talking to you, and it's adjacent to my garage downstairs. So it's in a non-finished, non-heated space. And my desk, I made it out of 2x12s, and it's a concrete floor, and it was freezing cold in January, but it's mine, it's my zone, and so this is where I get my work done. And so I would come down here bright and early, and I would work. I would sit here. I have my little TV up in the corner with the news that I don't listen to, but I watch, and it allows me to kind of rest my eyes as I'm looking at it. And I just cranked. I just try to get this thing off the ground, prospecting to find shops to buy and raising money. And it was just nonstop phone calls and kind of hustling. But I knew that that's not sustainable. Like I could not keep that up, and I didn't intend to. And so I intended to sprint like that until I got a foothold. And I thought that foothold would occur in about March, and it actually ended up occurring in mid-June. So where we closed the first shop and have traction, and we got the other deals lined up, and and it's everything's building, snowballing and building. Now I go into the office, so I have about a 45-minute to an hour commute each way, but I listen to my audiobooks and drive down there and get to be in a different environment. So I'm not in my home office anymore, but there's pros and cons to that, but it's just nonstop. And it's less deliberate than I'd like it to be. So it's less deliberate because I try to schedule, but mostly it's just putting out fires. So something for the military will pop up, and I'll answer the call, and then investors will call, or shops will call, and my employees will come in, and so it's mostly just putting fires out until the time I choose to leave, and then it's on the drive and answering phone calls until the time I choose to stop answering phone calls.
Well, you mentioned the importance of scheduling stuff, but at the same time, there's it sounds like a lot of volatility in your day, in the sense that something's going to come up from this part of your business, something's going to come up from your military service. How do you manage this scheduling on the one hand, but the need for flexibility to address things? Because I think that's what people who are struggling with time management find hard, is that they plan, but then there's a spanner that gets thrown in the works and it throws everything else out. So how do you deal with things that come up and not totally lose track of what you had planned for the day?
Yeah, that goes back to choosing what not to be good at. So I am known for not answering my phone, and it's unfortunate, but that's how I get my work done. Because my phone is, and also the scammer phone calls that I get now are like off the charts. So I can't even. So when I'll have I don't actually schedule this on my calendar, but if I'm working on something, I refuse to be interrupted by a phone call, and they'll leave a message. And I think that's a huge tool that people, I don't know if other people do that, but if you feel compelled to answer your phone, it's different if you have a boss, I get it, or if you're in some sort of hierarchical structure where you are expected to answer your phone, which I'm not anymore. so I can get away with that, but I'm a lot more productive that way. Any other fire that comes up that truly needs to be sorted, I mean, you obviously have to attend to that, and then your whole schedule gets changed, and I just work later to try to get it done.
Email can do it too. You can fall into this trap of checking your email every 5 minutes, and you just never finish anything. It comes back to, like you were saying, like carving out some time and monotasking as opposed to trying to multi.
To get more tactical, on email, I feel like I've got a good system there. I use Outlook like a lot of people, and I'll look at my email every 10 minutes or so, and I'll just flag everything that I need to attend to. And then before the end of the day, every day, I go through all the flagged emails, and I knock out the ones that need to get knocked out today. So now I know. Now it's off my brain because I know that it's in there. I've attended to what I needed to today. And once a week, I try to get to basically inbox zero on those flags. So I don't do anything with the rest of the emails, but I try to attend to all the flags. And that is a deeply satisfying thing
to accomplish. But satisfying.
Yeah. and go into the weekend. Now, for me too, I'm very particular about my workstation, so I like to have a desktop computer where where everything's kind of set up, and I do not like working off a laptop. And so, if I am working off a laptop, then I just can't. My mind just never going to get comfortable. So I need to get back to a desktop computer as soon as possible. And so that's a resilience versus high performance balance, right? That I'm willing to lean on the high performance side, right? I'm not very resilient if I'm not by my desktop computer. But when I get there, I'm a high performer, and I can just crank through work and get to a comfort level pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I went from a laptop when COVID hit back to a desktop, and I don't think I could go back, actually. Even though it's more mobile to have a laptop, I just like a proper sized keyboard and a desk that's laid out a particular way.
Exactly.
I do want to turn to a conversation that we have with every one of our guests on the podcast. And, depending on what their profession is, it's a little bit more specific. But just generally speaking, where do you see the world of work and business kind of going in the next 10 to 15 years? Because, off mic, you and I were talking about how machine learning, algorithms, automation is going to be changing the way a lot of things that we took for granted are going to be done. Where do you see the world of work and business going in the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that in the context of economics, productivity gains are what drive quality of life increases. That's the number one driver. And productivity gain, the number one driver of that is technology. Mm-hmm. And I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but at the turn of the century, 1900, a certain percentage of the U.S. economy was agriculture. It was a gigantic percentage, right? And now it's not a gigantic percentage, but we produce, multiples of produce and food and agricultural products that we did back then. And it's because of technology. And we're able to get more yield per acre and all that. So that was not fun for those farmers that lost their job.
Yeah.
Right? That was not fun. But today, we're glad it happened, right? Because those people that would otherwise be farmers are doing other things in our economy. And it's really the government's role to manage that transitory job loss and all that. And that's a policy debate. So I see that technology, in that context, technology is developing at an increasing rate. And again, I don't have figures off the top of my head, but I've heard some figures that are just mind blowing on how much data is produced every day as opposed to how much data was produced last year. And it's just exponential growth in capabilities and technology and all this. Now, what does that tell you? It means that these displaced people that are losing their jobs and getting kind of automated out, it's going to happen faster and faster and faster. Now, we've seen it in the middle economy, maybe the lower middle economy, with agricultural workers, fast food workers. It's coming for everybody above that. It's not coming for everybody below that. It's coming for everybody, but I think if you're fixing a car or you're putting in a brick wall or you're building a house, you're probably okay. If you're a lawyer or a banker or you're not an artist, you're not producing creative materials, and maybe even those people, you're going to be in trouble. And I don't know whether that's 10 years, 15 years, 50 years. I have no idea. It's likely 10 to 15 years in my mind. And so I think that, what does that mean? Now, we better hope that the productivity gain that we get outpaces the pain of the people that are getting displaced. And what I mean by that is, hey, if we can very quickly automate all this stuff and we're producing all this additional wealth and prosperity and it's being used correctly and all this, then it's not really a problem. But my money's on that not happening. And if I look at human history, we're not too good at correctly distributing wealth. And I say that on both sides. Like, some people argue it should not be distributed at all, and some people argue that it should be distributed more. And I'm not making a case for either. I'm just saying we're not very good at it. And so it's going to lead to all sorts of problems for all sorts of professions unless you are at basically the lower economy, and you're probably going to be fine. And frankly, if you're in the lower economy, you're probably going to be, your quality of life is going to increase because there's going to be more prosperity sloshing around in the government and in the economy and, technology availability and all that. So that's a really long answer, but I think that there's really no way of anticipating where this is going. And so I don't really think there's a lot we can do to try to position ourselves individually to get in front of it or to protect ourselves other than just be useful in a way that a computer can't.
Yeah. Well,
good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting too to think about what you were saying before about having multiple forms of income. And I think COVID has driven that point home painfully to a lot of people. If you had one income source and you lost it or it was fundamentally compromised because of COVID, you were in a difficult place. Mm-hmm. But if you had several incomes, you might lose a significant amount of it, but you didn't lose all of it. And I think that's where at least having some entrepreneurial interest is a really appealing thing, even if it's a side gig, like driving Uber. You've at least got some other income coming in. That doesn't answer the question of how's that going to affect our ability?
On that point, the same people that got hit hard by COVID, and my heart goes out to them, were the same people that technology has been hitting the hardest, right? If you were a construction worker, you likely did not, you were an essential service. And in a lot of places, construction spiked and is still high, and government knocked out all these construction projects, so you were doing okay. If you were information technology or you were anywhere in the kind of the white collar professions, you got to work from home and you saved money for the most part. I don't want to discount the pain that was felt by lots of people, but for the most part, you saved money, and then you got a stimulus and you got to work from home because technology could enable that. If you were a housekeeper or a restaurant worker or anywhere in these places that technology was already automating and hammering, you got double
retail.
Hammered. Yeah, retail. And frankly, that filters into why a lot of these policies were what they were with the lockdowns. It's because the people that were making the decisions and the people that had the influence were not the ones getting hammered. And I think that you're going to see the same phenomenon when it comes to non-COVID, technology and artificial intelligence. You're going to see the same phenomenon. And so, without going too far down the rabbit hole, Ben, that's something we need to be careful of. And the ones that are influential with the policymakers are not going to be the ones feeling the pain.
Yeah.
So that's setting us up for some dangerous issues as the face of work changes.
Yeah, that's all right. There were still policymakers going to get their hair done and eating at fancy restaurants when none of us could. You know, it's the old do as I say, not as I do.
That's right. On that note.
Well, Logan, thank you so much for your time. I think this has been really insightful, and I hope for our listeners it's given them a little bit of an insight into not only just how to approach challenge and the need to strive, but also just a bit of an insight into the challenges and the rewards of being an entrepreneur.
Well, thanks for having me, Ben.
Thanks for coming on.